Welcome. We're really glad that you're here with us today. Chances are you've been part of, or you're currently part of, or perhaps you expect soon to be part of an organizational redesign. And that's not surprising. In the past 3 years at Kissinger Group, we have seen a notable uptick in the number of organizational restructures. It seems that companies are trying to outpace disruption and competitive pressure, and so they're moving quickly. And just because we are seeing more organizational restructures, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily better. Oftentimes, organizations treat a redesign more with a blunt instrument than looking at it as an art. And there's a really good reason to try to do it right. Most organizations are looking for increased efficiency, increased competitiveness. That's why they're doing it. And the paradox is that it is messy and it is disruptive. And oftentimes, the messy and disruptive creates actually a dip in productivity. So we call that the productivity paradox. And if you're here, you're probably looking to avoid that. So we tapped two of our experts. Between the two of them, they have done almost 40 organizational redesigns at many, many different companies. And we asked them to share the good, bad, and ugly of organizational redesign. And what we did today is we pre-recorded a panel interview and put together a worksheet so that you can activate all of this on your own after the session. And we want to make the most out of your 30 minutes. So you can ask questions in the comments section, and you can do that anytime through March 15th, and we'll respond to them. So we're just about ready to hit the play button. Before we do, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists, Wendy Bowers and Brianna Sharp. Wendy is an organizational design specialist who has lots of organizational effectiveness chops as well and has spent about 25 years doing this. She is a board member at the Organizational Design Forum and a certified organizational design professional. And she's been through it all with 18 different major redesigns across the board. And Brianna Sharp has been through about 20 of them with about 20 years in the business and has worked for large organizations like Deloitte. She's done a lot of merger integration work and brings a whole lot to bear here. And we're going to go ahead and push the button and let you see what they have to say.
I'd like to start by asking you each to look back over your 20 years of experience doing this and tell us, what do you consider to be the biggest mistakes that you see organizations make?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. The three that I see most commonly, the first is really designing around the people that you already have. A lot of organizations also start their process without really knowing what they're trying to solve, which kind of leads to thinking that doing an org design or a restructuring alone will solve whatever they're trying to address.
I'd add a couple more. As we're going through a redesign process, I think communication is really key and important, and allowing too much time between meaningful communications allows unease and people create their own narrative about what's happening. The other thing is it's really important to plan for and budget for post-launch support. Organization will need ongoing, what I call organizational development, investment in teams, investment in leaders, and making sure that's planned and budgeted for in advance is often overlooked.
That's great. Really good stuff. And we're going to jump into some strategies now for how do you overcome some of those challenges.
And keep in mind during all this messiness that there are a few big principles to follow. Uh, so let's start with one we all hear about all the time, which is communication. And it's a hot topic. How, if I'm a leader, should I be thinking about communication during an organizational redesign?
I'd start with the distinction between clarity and transparency. One that we really see is as a leader, you want to communicate for clarity, but employees often expect transparency. And those two things are different. And sometimes organizations really commingle the two, really just being with clarity, you want to be really deliberate about what you can and cannot share and when, and being as direct as possible. But it doesn't mean that you're sharing absolutely everything. To the extent that you can, you want to be direct as possible with your employees, especially when things change from the original plan. And this does happen, but no one likes those cagey or generic answers. And one way you can do it is really talk about what you're willing to communicate or answer and not. And one example I could share is that on a project I was on, we were really open about how employees would be mapped into roles in the future state and what the process was for employees to raise their hand if they were interested in certain roles. But we were not going to have the leaders discuss why certain decisions were made.
I think the cadence is important. I touched on this kind of at the beginning. Having that plan on the frequency and regularity of communications goes a long way. Communications take a fair amount of effort to put together, to think through, as what Brianna touched on around the clarity and what can be shared. I've seen those time spans extend unexpectedly as we grapple with what they're able to say or willing to say. So thinking about that in advance and keeping in mind anything around the business context that drives or limits when communications can happen, right? Any blackout periods for certain organizations or functions, quarterly earnings, unexpected business things that come up that have to be communicated as a priority, right? Can all of that affect the cadence? So tracking that, being thoughtful about it so that time span is not too great, I think is pretty important.
Yeah, yeah. Great. So we've talked about clarity. We've talked about the cadence. And how can when we think about these are great rules to follow, but what is the best way to structure this or package this so that we're sure we're getting it out in a consistent way?
Yeah. I think the best thing is to really have a messaging architecture. So even just think about it if you're don't come from a communication background, an outline. So you have those foundational things that you're going to build from that go throughout, and then you can create supporting messages around those. And you really want to go back to those as often as possible. What, Wendy, I'm sure you found the same thing. It takes a lot of repetition to get employees to really, not just employees, people to really understand and absorb a message. And so you can't overdo it by going back to those core messages and leaving them throughout. And I would even draw on an example of a project I worked on where we really went back to that messaging structure and had a monthly series of communications we did with the employees. And even though to the leaders and to the consultants, it might have felt repetitive, to the employees, it doesn't.
Brianna, it's a time when there's a lot of confusion and a lot of noise. So when you talk about your messaging structure and having a few key points, how many points are are simple enough that people can really understand it?
Oh, that's a great question. I'd probably say no more than 5 to 7. You don't wanna overcomplicate it. And in fact, sometimes if you overcomplicate it, it almost seems like you're hiding something. So I would say simpler is better.
Yeah, I think that consistency and repeatability is important.
Let's say that this is great for
of the mountain here. How about your leaders that are maybe a little bit farther down? How do we equip these folks to talk to their constituents in a way that's consistent and they know what they can say and what they can't say?
So part of it depends on kind of the maturity of the leaders that we're talking about and the complexity of the messaging. I have found that it works best when an investment is really made in equipping those leaders with tools, talking points, training, opportunities to practice. They are key in the cascade, and not just a one-time cascade, but in engaging employees in dialogue. The better foundation we can give them, the better they will be equipped to do it successfully.
The other thing I'd add on top of that is equipping them how to respond, because it's not just them delivering the message, it's also how they engage in a dialogue with their employees. As Wendy said, making that investment in how to have difficult conversations, how to deal with resistance, and even how to answer questions you don't have the answer to, because those will happen, is such a wise investment. And I'd say the number one thing I'd tell all of my clients is if you don't know the answer, don't speculate or make things up. That will only make things much more difficult.
Yeah, I think that's one of the toughest things for leaders to deal with is if they don't have answers and they feel obligated to tell their employees something. So that's a great point.
So what that looks like, it's more than just giving those leaders a memo and saying, here, repeat this memo with your staff. Or scenario-based type of training or tools. So navigate through it, not just repeat a story.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's excellent. And do organizations take the time to do this? Do you see people doing this? Because it's a lot of work.
I have, for sure. Not every time. We've seen organizations, and some of it's driven by time and availability,
Sure.
capacity in the project plan. Sometimes by budget, but I find the resistance is more around time than anything.
I do have clients who've done it. Usually, if I get resistance to investing that time up front, it's just their managers or their leaders, they should know how to do this, and thinking that taking time from their busy day won't really benefit them.
That leaves the managers without a lot of tools if they are just expected to know. So I love the idea of giving them scenarios and really helping them process. I want to switch gears for a moment. We hear a lot about good org design people talk a lot about employee buy-in, and that's a big term. And I'd love to hear from each of you on what that means and how you do it well.
So at the macro level, when we think about the total transformation, employee buy-in is really a key factor in adoption, right? Employees are going to have to live with that future state. New teams, new leaders, new ways of working, new scope of work, new paths of escalation. Depending on what the change is, there's a lot of different things that are going to impact their day-to-day. That concept of buy-in is really around them adopting, living the change, minimizing their resistance, finding the early adopters and champions who model what we're targeting. So it shows up in a lot of different ways, and that's that bigger concept of buy-in. I'd like to just talk about the early stages of them being involved in a project. I think that there's time or opportunity, if you will, to start that buy-in early in terms of bringing them involved, bringing them along and giving them the opportunity to provide input to the project. So conversations or workshops around current state, around organizational strengths or opportunities. Maybe if you're at the level of redesigning work processes, you want them to help map those or document what they are so that you can assess them when going through the change. So really engaging them in current state is one option. Another thing that I've often done is engaging staff or leaders around the future state. So ideating on what that future state might involve, what are the considerations when we're thinking about designing the future state. So these type of collaborative design sessions really allow people to bring forward their understanding of the opportunities and risks. So not just receive it from somebody else, but work through how they see this change shaking out or the opportunities within the change. Conversations around risk and risk mitigation. I've had sessions where we brought in diverse leaders and people have come in with really pre-established ideas of what they think the future design should be. And as they dialogue with their peers, they open their thinking and start to realize that maybe their design option had maybe more negatives or more risk associated with it. And the power of that is they're hearing from each other and they're learning from each other, not from somebody, an upper leader or a external consultant telling them the answer. They're co-creating that understanding.
Love that. But how do you, if I'm in the room and now I feel ownership, which is great, how do you ensure that there's clarity on who actually gets to make the decision? And does that cause confusion in that regard?
Yeah, so that's where I think there's a really good opportunity up front to be really clear about how the input's going to be used. Giving input is different than decision making. So it is an opportunity to shape the thinking, provide information, give, share about the realities of the organization, either current, past, or future. And I think the best thing that leaders and consultants can do is really explain how their input is going to be used and make sure it isn't conflated with decision making.
That's
What
excellent.
looks like tangibly is at the start of the project, working with leaders to explicitly discuss who will make the organization design decisions. Especially if you're working with kind of VPs and tenured leaders in a collaborative design, it's easy for them to assume they're going to be part of the decision-making process, and they might not be, especially if we're their scope or their role. And so if we're not explicit on the boundaries of their decision-making or who's going to decide, we run the risk of them feeling sidelined or overlooked when it's actually a decision. Being explicit about that early is a pretty important kind of thinking process to go through. And a step when we talk about communications, right? It becomes an important communication point in terms of setting those expectations.
Great. So this collaborative design is a great way to get people involved in and make them feel part of it. What are some other tips or things that you've seen that have worked really well to get buy-in and to engage constituents?
So once a design is complete, so say it's final, we know the future state, we've mapped people to roles and we're ready to share that. We're now talking and communicating with a broader set of stakeholders. So we've gone from senior leadership and we're now talking to numbers of teams and larger numbers of people. Being thoughtful about how to engage them in the content and the decisions that have been made is important. One of the things I like to use is a framework of head, heart, and hands. So it's used as a way to check that we're hitting or that our communications are touching on a number of things. So head would be the what and the why of the change, the business context, the rationale. Heart really touches on the emotional side. What are the fears and the aspirations of the people we're talking to? Concerns they might have around their personal work. They're wondering about who their new boss might be. What about their teammates? What's going to happen to all this work? Did the team members consider all this work needs to go to a new place, right? Really touching on both concerns, but also aspirations. Where do I go? What does this mean for my career progression? What does this mean around the company's growth? And then Hands would be the skills needed either to implement the change, right? Do I need upskilling? Do I need new training? Do I need specific system access? Perhaps tangible resources to get something done in a different way. So, touching on head, heart, and hands, or at least using that as a framework to test and pressure test the communications, I find very useful.
Love that. And we often hear about hearts and minds, right? Got to win the hearts and minds of people. But people so often forget hands. Here's what you do. Here's how you take this thing that feels intangible and you make it a reality. So that's a great framework. So as we're engaging with our constituents, obviously we're getting real-time feedback all along the way. But how do we know that we're really securing buy-in? What are some ways of identifying this is going well or whoa, we're getting a lot of pushback?
Yeah, I think there's a few. You can do the formal things like pulse surveys and look at employee engagement surveys, but I think the best key is really looking at your frontline managers and pulsing them and saying, what are you hearing? Because they're the ones on the ground interacting with it every day, seeing how their teams are reacting, seeing what's working and not working.
We've done things at times where we run massive spreadsheets where we ask frontline managers to put in the questions they're hearing to better document so we can see if there's patterns, right? So it's not just ad hoc casual, but we do put some structure around that.
Yeah.
Again, back to the training of or the preparing of the managers, a transformation does require their time and their attention. And so they go through a phase where they're not just doing their job, but they're actually actively working on the organization. And so it does mean carving out attention and time for them to engage with the organization, maybe document it, maybe come together in working sessions to dialogue about it. That listening closely is pretty important. And Brianna said surveys, focus groups, roundtables, all of those are different methods depending on the client or the scope of the project that I've seen work very effectively.
You just, I don't know how many times you just used the word work. I think that's very telling. This is not something you just do. It's a lot of work. And it's a big commitment. And oftentimes the people go through all of this big redesign and they say, ta-da, it's done. And now everybody go out and do the new thing. I have a feeling that you two believe that there's more that has to happen beyond the day one. Okay, we're all operating differently. And I'd love to hear how you both feel about the sustainability and the long tail of the effect of a redesign.
Sandra, I think you just hit on something really important. I think so often the mistake is made of like the announcement, the unveiling is the finish line when it's really another start line. That's where I think things often get undergone is okay, great, we're done. And I think the thing that can really help is using again communication and buy-in to set that foundation, but also being transparent that you're going to use this as a learning opportunity and that we all need to be adaptable as we lean into this new model. Organizations are living, breathing things. We're not machines. So, what I've often seen is that individuals and teams develop their own habits and frictions, but the best design structure doesn't work if all of the behavior and ways of working don't follow. So, this could mean that you need process redesign, which Wendy alluded to earlier. It could be conversations around stop, start, and continue about work that's happening and what it actually should be. And it could even be where do we need more areas of training?
Yeah, one of the things I've seen is as we're going through that period of kind of post communication or post launch, additional changes are needed. you learn and the organization might need to adapt. And so flexibility on the model is important. I have seen many organizations have to modify their model 6 months, 8 months out. One speed bump I've seen repeatedly is when future state roles, like really key future state roles, are fully funded. They're intended to be funded at some future state near term, and something happens, and they're unable to fund those roles. And that really then can change the design again. Not the end of the world, but keeping that in mind and retaining some capacity, organizational capacity, time, energy, et cetera, money to respond to that is very wise.
So hold some reserves here because you're going to need them to continue on beyond day one.
The other thing that one of my clients did that I actually really loved is they made a pretty substantial investment in their employees to make sure that they were equipped for these new roles. And they actually came up with, for all the key roles, a reboarding plan. So it's not onboarding. They're not new to the organization. But how do you take people who are already familiar with this organization and reboard them into a role that is either new or changed? And really making sure that they had training checklists to give them the best possible start as they stood up the new way of working.
Love that. Love that. I think that it even adds a little excitement and makes everybody feel like their hands are being held and we're going to do something fun. That's a nice idea, huh? So
So
were you going to say, Wendy?
we use that term long tail when you set up the question. And I think that is really a good way to think about this, is that there is a fair amount of work that extends out over time. So Brianna's example of reboarding, I had a client that really embraced the term activation. And so it was that kind of post-announcement, post-org change. And it continued in some cases weeks or months, partially because it's getting integrated into the regular business operations, right? The sequence of monthly staff meetings, quarterly on hand, all hands or offsites, time for teams to come together and gel. So some of the activation activities, for example, included team startup or trust and relationship building, workflow changes. There was period of time for role clarity and going through what Brianna said, stop, start, and continue, or handoffs between roles. There were manager toolkits, offsite sessions. There were just a lot of things around supporting the organization, the teams, the leaders, and the individuals over a period of time.
Excellent.
I'm gonna say the other thing I'd add is really thinking through that your metrics and your incentives are also aligned with this. So again, that's another one of those long tail activities. I worked with someone once who said what gets measured gets done. So if you aren't measuring and incentivizing people to do those new things, they're not going to. So you want to make sure that it's not just, again, the org design. It's not just bringing people along for the journey. It's actually making sure other supporting business processes like employee development and performance management are aligned to this as well.
That's excellent. This has been a terrific discussion. You two have brought a lot of value to the table, and I appreciate you both being here. And let's do it again.
Thank you. This was fun.
Thanks, Sandra.